Napoleon's empire is cracking. His Grande Armée is bleeding in Central Europe, and 1,200 miles away, in the mountains and valleys of Spain, another disaster is quietly taking shape. On one side, a tired but reborn British army under a cautious aristocrat the soldiers call Old Nosy. On the other, a hollow French kingdom ruled by Napoleon's own brother, clinging to wagons stuffed with gold, paintings, and stolen Spanish treasure. This is the story of how a single day on a dusty Spanish plain shattered French power in Iberia and helped set the stage for Napoleon's downfall. Stay with us, and if you enjoy deep dive history brought to life, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. May 1813. While Napoleon's Grande Armée was struggling to recover in Central Europe after the disaster in Russia, 1,200 miles away, at the other end of his crumbling empire, another enemy was ready to strike. The previous year, Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army had won a brilliant victory at Salamanca, only to be stopped cold before the fortress of Burgos and forced into a long, draining retreat all the way back to the Portuguese frontier. But after a winter of rest, reinforcement, and training, that army was transformed. It now numbered around 100,000 men, most of them hardened veterans who'd survived years of campaigning. For the first time, Wellington had enough cavalry and artillery at his disposal, and his transport and medical services had been overhauled. Morale was sky high. Their commander, whom the troops jokingly called Old Nosy, was cheered wherever he rode. "I never saw the British army so healthy or so strong," Wellington wrote home to London. The French situation in Spain, by contrast, was dire. Napoleon had badly underestimated Wellington and had just withdrawn 20,000 French troops to feed his new campaign in Germany. As commander-in-chief in Spain, King Joseph knew the army under his command was stretched to breaking point. Napoleon allowed his brother to abandon Madrid and move his court to Valladolid, which was easier to defend. But pulling back any farther, to the strong natural line of the river Ebro, was out of the question. A retreat like that would send exactly the wrong message to neutral Austria and to Napoleon's wavering German allies, who were already beginning to lose faith. And so, with a growing sense of unease, Joseph and his chief of staff, Marshal Jourdan, waited to see where Wellington's blow would fall. Wellington's plan was to advance in two great wings, join them at Toro, then turn east and strike directly at Joseph's army. In the south, General Murray's Anglo-Sicilian Spanish force, based at Alicante, had just fought off an attack by Marshal Suchet at Castalla. Now Murray was to launch a diversionary amphibious landing along the Mediterranean coast, timed to coincide with Wellington's advance, and to pin Suchet in place so he could not send reinforcements north. Wellington had also hoped for large-scale support from Spain's regular armies, forces for which, at least on paper, he had been commander-in-chief since November 1812. But in Cadiz, the Spanish Cortes was deeply divided. Many deputies still distrusted British intentions. In practice, Wellington could only count on a handful of reliable Spanish divisions fighting directly under his direction. Fortunately, he had another ally, the Spanish guerrillas. These irregular fighters were now better armed, better organized, and operating in greater numbers than ever before. In Valencia, a vast stretch of countryside had effectively been liberated by the friar-turned-guerrilla leader known as El Fraile, the Friar. In Navarre, Espoz y Mina had captured several major towns and was tying down General Clausel's Army of the North, while around Madrid, Juan Martín Díaz, the famous El Empecinado, kept large French forces bogged down in endless skirmishing. On May 22nd, Wellington finally said farewell to Portugal and began his advance. 4 days later, he reached Salamanca, where he joined forces with the northern wing of his army under Sir Thomas Graham. Joseph and Jourdan were convinced that the main Allied thrust would come from Salamanca, so they planned to hold the line of the River Douro. But Graham's rapid advance north of the river threatened to turn their right flank, and they had no choice but to order a retreat. Through a series of precise, daring marches, Wellington kept up the pressure, constantly threatening the French right and forcing Joseph to fall back from one position to the next. The British and Portuguese troops moved along minor roads and mountain tracks that twisted through the hills north of the main highway, routes the French had dismissed as impassable. With Spanish allies as their guides, Wellington's staff knew better.
Backed by British sea power, Wellington was also able to shift his main supply base from Lisbon to Santander, dramatically shortening his supply lines, another feat the French had once written off as impossible. At the River Ebro, the French found themselves outflanked yet again and fell back on the city of Vitoria. Here, Joseph chose to make his stand. The valley of the River Zadorra, just west of the city, seemed to offer a strong defensive position. Expecting the main attack to come from the west, he drew up his forces in 3 lines. In front, General Gazan's army of the south. Behind it, General d'Erlon's army of the centre. And finally, General Rey's army of Portugal. Joseph's hope was simple. If he could not win, he could at least buy time. Time for the great wagon convoy gathered east of Vitoria to escape. It carried not just military supplies and the government treasury, but, as British cartoonists gleefully mocked, the loot of 5 years of French occupation. Priceless paintings, jewels and antiques, stripped from Spanish palaces and churches. He was also counting on General Clausel, who was marching with 20,000 reinforcements. But thanks to the guerrillas, Wellington had better information about Clausel's whereabouts than Joseph did. Knowing that Clausel could not possibly arrive before June 22nd, Wellington decided to strike on the 21st. The day before the battle, French patrols reported Allied troop movements to the north. In response, Rey's troops were shifted to cover the army's line of communications to France, except for one division, which was detached to escort part of the wagon train towards the frontier. A curious decision that deprived Joseph of 4,000 men on the eve of battle. That same day, Marshal Jourdan lay sick in bed with a fever. The next morning, he and King Joseph rode out together to inspect their position. Both men saw at once that the French line was overextended and needed to be shortened. But by the time their orders reached General Gazan, it was too late. His troops were already under attack. For once, Wellington enjoyed a clear advantage in numbers. He decided to attack in 4 columns across a 10-mile front, with Graham's left-hand column swinging wide to threaten Joseph's only line of retreat. It was a bold plan, with the potential to trap and destroy Joseph's entire army. But it depended on tight coordination and careful timing. Fortunately for Wellington, the French had not destroyed any of the bridges over the Zadorra, and the river could also be forded in several places. At 8 a.m., General Hill's column began the assault on the Allied right. British and Spanish troops climbed the western heights of Puebla, drove off French skirmishers, and forced Gazan to send reinforcements to shore up his exposed left flank. Hill's men captured the village of Subijana, but heavy French artillery fire and determined counterattacks stopped any further advance. Convinced that Hill's attack was the main Allied effort and that the movements to the north were just a diversion, Jourdan continued to strip troops from the centre to reinforce his left, exactly what Wellington needed him to do. But by 11 a.m., Wellington was growing impatient. His other columns were late. Dalhousie's 7th Division, which was supposed to spearhead the centre-left attack, was held up on the mounting roads. Farther east, Graham's turning movement had begun at a crawl. When he saw the size of the force approaching him, General Ray decided to pull back across the Zadorra to the east bank. That retreat finally shook Graham out of his caution. Colonel Longa's Spanish division advanced on Durana, held by Spanish troops loyal to Joseph, and a bitter fight erupted for control of the village. British and Portuguese infantry attacked Gamara Mea, plunging into brutal street fighting with the French. This was where the 4th King's Own Regiment of Foot and the 47th Lancashire Regiment launched their famous assault. They drove the French out of the village, but could not force a crossing over the bridge, which was swept by well-placed French guns. Around midday, a Spanish peasant told Wellington that the bridge at Tres Puentes was completely unguarded. Wellington immediately ordered Kempt's elite light infantry brigade to rush across and seize a bridgehead on the far bank. Even so, there was still no sign of Dalhousie. General Picton, the notoriously short-tempered commander of the fighting 3rd Division, finally lost patience. He ordered his men forward, storming across the bridge at Mendoza and a nearby ford, and driving back the thin French screen in front of them. With his left pinned at Subijana and his right now threatened with a flanking attack, Gazan had no choice but to pull back. By this stage, Wellington's army was crossing the Zadorra on a broad front. Fierce fighting continued on the heights of Puebla, but the French were forced to give ground there too, to keep their new line from breaking apart. Scottish Highlanders, the Irish Connaught Rangers, riflemen, and Portuguese infantry now surged forward against the village of Arinhez. They smashed through the defenders, who fell back toward the southeast, and in doing so, opened up a dangerous gap between Gazan's army of the south and D'Erlon's army of the center. The Allied advance pressed in hard on both French flanks. Wellington's army seemed to be gathering unstoppable momentum, while Graham's column was steadily moving into position to cut off Joseph's escape. By 4 p.m., the Allies were deployed in strength across the Zadorra, ready to deliver the finishing blow. Then, French artillery opened up. 76 guns tore into the Allied infantry, blasting great gaps in their ranks. Allied guns were hauled forward to answer. The biggest artillery duel of the entire Peninsular War erupted, with more than 70 guns in action on each side. Allied skirmishers, using the growing gap near Gomecha, worked their way around behind the French batteries, shooting down gunners at their posts. Gazan now found both his flanks in danger. Instead of closing up on D'Erlon to form a united defensive line, he chose on his own initiative to retreat. That decision left D'Erlon's left completely exposed. At almost the same moment, Longa's Spaniards finally broke through and captured Durana. and a rumor swept through the French ranks. Their road to France had been cut. D'Erlon's army of the center fought on bravely, falling back to yet another defensive line, barely a mile west of Vitoria. Once again, that position was outflanked. Around 5:30 p.m., Joseph accepted what was now obvious. The battle was lost. He ordered a general retreat. With the main road to France blocked by Longa's troops, the army's only escape was toward Pamplona, along a single narrow road bordered by boggy fields. Worse still, no one had ordered the great wagon train to start moving earlier in the day. Now soldiers, guns, and hundreds of wagons were all trying to escape along the same choked route. Chaos followed. Artillery batteries, infantry columns, and baggage wagons jammed the road and spilled out into the fields. The job of forming a rear guard fell to Reille's army of Portugal, which managed an orderly withdrawal and used its cavalry to keep the Allies at bay. Wellington hoped that Graham would now be surging across the Zadorra to cut off the French retreat, but Graham, overestimating the enemy's strength, continued to move cautiously. East of Vitoria, the French retreat collapsed into a full-blown disaster. The narrow road became hopelessly blocked. Wagons that tried to escape across the fields sank into the mud and were abandoned. Allied cavalry fell upon the tangled mass of fugitives, spreading panic and meeting little serious resistance. King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan narrowly escaped capture. Among the wagon train they left behind were civilians, officers' wives and children, priceless paintings, jewelry, furniture, and more than 5 million francs in gold and silver. Soldiers on both sides broke ranks and rushed to plunder. One British officer later wrote, "At dusk, the head of our column suddenly came upon some wagons that had been abandoned by the enemy. Someone called out, 'They're money carts.' No sooner were the words spoken than the division broke as if by word of command. In an instant, the covers were torn off, and nothing was to be seen but a forest of upturned legs, while the arms were groping for dollars. The scene was disgraceful, but at the same time, irresistibly comic. Wellington did not laugh. The looting had delayed the pursuit, and a fortune that might have paid for his army's future supplies had vanished into private pockets. Out of 5.5 million francs, the army recovered only about 250,000. Vitoria was a major Allied victory. It had not annihilated the French army. The casualty figures were relatively modest, but the Allies had captured 151 of the 153 French guns, and even Jourdan's Marshal's baton. French military power in the Iberian Peninsula was broken. The Bonapartist Kingdom of Spain was finished. Joseph returned to France to face his brother's anger. Jourdan retired from active service. Napoleon sent Marshal Soult to take command in Spain, but even his sharp military mind could not turn the tide. Counterattacks to relieve the French garrisons at Pamplona and San Sebastian all failed. That autumn, Wellington launched an advance that could no longer be stopped, driving across the Pyrenees and carrying the war onto French soil itself. In southern Spain, where Marshal Suchet had never yet been beaten in the field, the disaster at Vitoria forced him to withdraw toward the frontier as well, leaving only a handful of isolated garrisons behind.
After 5 devastating years of conflict, the Allies, and for the Spanish, this was their long War of Independence, had finally won. It had been a long road, soaked in blood and tears. The alliance between Britain and Spain had been especially difficult to manage, but in the end, together with Portugal, they had forced the French back over the Pyrenees. Recent research has revealed just how terrible the French losses in Iberia really were. An estimated 260,000 dead. 3/4 of them died from sickness. Of roughly 66,000 combat deaths, about 43% fell fighting Spanish regular troops, 38% against British-led armies, and 19% in actions against the guerrillas. By comparison, British losses are estimated at around 52,000 and Portuguese at 15,000. Tens of thousands of civilians also died, while total Spanish fatalities remain unknown. But the country may have lost as many as 500,000 people in just 5 years of war and occupation. For Napoleon, the Peninsular War was a catastrophe he need never have started, a war born of arrogance and miscalculation, with strategic consequences that were impossible to fully repair. And while his empire was cracking apart in Spain, an even greater trial was reaching its climax in Central Europe, where Napoleon now faced the most powerful coalition of enemies he had ever known. If the French emperor could win in Germany, Wellington might yet find himself scrambling back over the Pyrenees. The fate of Europe was about to be decided at the Battle of Leipzig. At Vitoria, Wellington didn't destroy Napoleon's brother's army outright, but he broke something far more important: French control over Spain, and the illusion that the Bonaparte dynasty could hold its stolen throne. 5 years of brutal war, 500,000 dead, and an empire drained of men and money, all for a crown Napoleon never needed to take. Yet even as French power collapsed beyond the Pyrenees, a greater storm was gathering in Central Europe. Because while Joseph fled Spain, his brother was marching toward the largest battle of his career, and the moment that would decide the fate of Europe. Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. If you want to follow this story all the way to Napoleon's final reckoning, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which campaign you want to see next. Your support helps keep these stories alive.